All right. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. My name is Carson Gorecki. I am the Regional Labor Market Analyst for Northeast Minnesota. And I'm very happy to be with you today to talk about some labor market information. For those of you that are unfamiliar, DEED is the state agency responsible for economic development, workforce development. Many things that we do include business recruitment, job training, retention, international trade, workforce development, community development, and a whole lot more. Within it, we have the Labor Market Information Office, which is what I am a part of. And labor market information covers a whole broad array of different types of data. What you may be most familiar with is unemployment rates, jobs numbers that come out monthly. In fact, we just had the April numbers come out last month. And this morning, as of 4 minutes ago, we had some local unemployment and labor force numbers come out. So there's always fresh information coming through to keep things interesting. And in addition to those top line numbers that you may be more familiar with, we also have wages, employment by industry, occupation, pathways information, occupations in demand, job vacancy information, and also graduate employment outcomes, just to name a few. There's a bunch more, but we're going to cover just a slice of it today, and we're going to focus in on those tools and data that may be most relevant and helpful in the realm of economic development, research in a general sense, economic research, and grant writing. So we're going to talk about these basic LMI concepts to start. We're going to do a brief labor market update, including some examples from the tools we'll talk through in more detail. I list some of the tools I hope to get to here, but depending on how much detail we go through, the number we get through will vary based off the time we have allotted. But I underlined and bolded the ones I really hope to focus on. And then there's a couple of grant writing examples I have as well that we can kind of walk through and show how these data can be applied in an actual grant application situation. I talked about what the Labor Market Information Office does. There's one in each state. So every state has labor market information. However, not every state is as good as Minnesota, I will say. No, we all produce similar information, but we have leeway to kind of create added value, build upon the basic federally mandated data, which are those unemployment and job statistics, among a few. Job vacancy surveys, an example of where we go kind of above and beyond. So there's some added value there that you may not get in some other states. And we are fortunate in Minnesota to be well supported, and we are pretty central to decision making, which is our aim. We hope to be the foundation for informed market response planning. The types of data that we provide and work with can be divided into two different camps. You've got survey-based data, so that's an example of that would be the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls 65,000 households every month and asks them questions like, are you employed? If you're not employed, have you looked for work in the last 4 weeks? That would be an example of survey-based data that we get for local area unemployment statistics and current employment statistics. Our job vacancy survey I mentioned. Census and administrative data, unemployment insurance statistics is created via the unemployment insurance system. So when a business submits their unemployment filings, with that, we get a trove of very useful information that we can use to build up our quarterly census of employment and wage data, as well as several other really useful data tools. And that is by taking the whole array of folks. So quarterly census of employment and wages, for example, covers about 95% of employment in the state. What do we do with that information, with these data? We do a whole bunch of different things. First thing is share this information with the public so they can make decisions, but help folks to interpret and understand what's available and what it means. We write a lot of publications. I do a monthly blog. We write quarterly publications. We also do reports on different industries, different areas, profiles, same. I present to all manners of organizations and audiences. A couple weeks back, I was presenting to a high school group, a college group, a workforce development board, some individual businesses, and I also was at a housing summit a couple weeks back. So a broad array of folks can use these data. We also answer specific data requests. So if you have some specific request and you can't really find it yourself or don't have the time or capacity to find it yourself, us regional labor market analysts are here to help you with those types of questions. And we create new tools. So we take the data that exist in specific tools and we combine them to see if we can have some new insights or value added. All right. Quickly, we have a lot of different jurisdictions. It's just useful to know this because depending on what tool you're in, you could be talking about different levels of geography. I talk about planning areas or planning regions quite a bit. That's upper right. I'm in Northeast Minnesota, the 7-county Northeast Minnesota planning region. That also coincides with Economic Development Region 3, but you can see that it's not as easily organized in the rest of the state. I'm the fortunate analyst that has the easiest geography. We also work with counties, workforce development areas, or workforce service areas, but then metropolitan statistical areas as well. Where do our data come from? All sorts of different places, but some of the top ones that we get information from: the Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. Census Bureau. We get data from other Minnesota state agencies like Revenue, Education, Minnesota Works, and Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So we use information for wherever we can get it, but the sources are varied. And just to dive into the actual concepts a little bit, one thing when I talk about the labor force, it's good to understand what I'm referring to, right? So labor force is from a specific subset of total population, and specifically here it is the civilian non-institutional population 16 or older. So non-institutional broadly is, you're not in prison, for example. And then you can break that out into two level good flow chart, break that into whether people are working or not working. If you're working, you're employed. If you're not working, it gets a little more complicated. But if you look for work in the last 4 weeks, that's our common measure of unemployment. But employed and unemployed, put them together, that's what you get, the labor force. So when I talk about labor force, that is what I'm referring to specifically. And then for folks that are outside of the labor force, they either want a job or they don't. There are folks that are outside of the labor force that do want a job, they just haven't looked for a while. That's typically the kind of main camp they fall into. And we refer to them as marginally attached or discouraged workers. A little more detail on the unemployment rate. I kind of mentioned a little bit about it earlier. If you've looked in the last 4 weeks, but don't have a job, you're deemed to be in what we call this U3 unemployment rate. And that's what we publish every month and what everybody refers to in the newspapers, et cetera. But there are different ways to measure unemployment, going from the most narrow, which would just be folks in long-term unemployment, to the broadest, which would be folks that include those marginally attached, those discouraged people, and those folks that are even working, but part-time, basically not by choice for some economic reason. Okay, so you got a basis of those most common labor market concepts. So now let's apply them and look at some of the data via a labor market update. How is the job market doing? That's the question, right? Well, I'll let you kind of decide for yourself. There are some mixed indicators, but the top one here that I'll start with is the unemployment rate. And by that measure, the economy is humming along. So we've got pretty low unemployment in a historical sense. Not seasonally adjusted statewide, it was 3.2% in March. If you look at the seasonally adjusted, so that's factoring in your ups and downs that you typically see in a given year, 2.7%. So under 3, which is the typical kind of baseline for what we call full employment in economics. So under 3% means relatively tight, relatively low unemployment. And then you can see how that varies across the state by workforce service area on the left, and then by county on the right. Northeast Minnesota, my area, tends to have a little bit higher unemployment. We have more seasonal type of work. So compared to the state, we tend to see a little bit higher unemployment rates. Statewide, looking at the labor force trends of the last couple of years, that top blue line is the number of people in the labor force, so working or currently looking for work. And you can see that there's a pretty big spike and then drop early on in the pandemic. Since then, the general trend has been slow but steady recovery, people joining or rejoining the labor force. The orange line is the number of folks employed. And then if you get the difference between those two lines, that's the unemployment rate. And 2.7%, as I mentioned, we've had that for 6 months straight now. So pretty consistently low unemployment. And you can see how that's come down since the peak of the pandemic in 2020. And how does that compare to pre-pandemic? You can see that the level is just a little bit lower, a couple of tenths of percentage points down. When we focus in on that labor force longer term, you can see that we had growth in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then since 2000, essentially, we've seen a decline in the labor force participation rate. So that is the share of folks that are eligible, 16 plus non-institutional, that are either working or looking for work. And that rise is mostly attributable to women entering the labor force. And then that decline is mostly attributable to our aging population, aging workforce. And then, of course, the pandemic accelerated some of those trends. You can see in 2020, 2021, how that dropped even more precipitously. However, 68.1%, up a little bit into 2022, and it's gone up a little bit into 2023. That is still quite high relative to the national average, which is around 62%. So Minnesota does have higher labor force participation, and that's kind of the case for Midwest in general. How about Northeast Minnesota, if you're in my region or curious about it? We've seen some similar trends, but we've seen less of a rebound in terms of our labor force over the last couple of years. In 2009, that was the peak of our labor force in Northeast Minnesota. And while we have about 7,500, 8,000 folks fewer in the labor force, the population is roughly the same. So we have an aging workforce, an aging population. Our labor force has declined as people retired. At the same time, unemployment has been coming down pretty consistently. Like if you got rid of 2020, you can see a pretty constant trend of unemployment coming down. So fewer people are looking for work, generally because they're finding it in a tight labor market. We've seen a jump up from 3.5 to 3.6% in unemployment, but that's still very low historically for our region. Put those two together and then add in job vacancy survey data, so the number of job openings we have statewide, and we get a real measure of the tightness of the labor market. The black dots represent the number of job seekers divided into the number of job openings. So in 2009, at the peak of the Great Recession, we had 8.2 job seekers for every job vacancy. So that was a very employer-friendly market. It meant that they kind of had their choice of applicants, and then a lot of people were looking for work relative to the number of jobs available. Since that point, those dots have declined to the point where we have fewer than one job seeker per job opening. Even before the pandemic, there was a brief spike in 2020, and now we're even lower. We have basically a half a person or less, according to last year's data, of job seekers per job vacancy. So very tight labor market, and it's the flip of the Great Recession, where now the job seekers kind of have more of the power. They're in higher demand. Employers are looking to hire, and there's just fewer people to hire. What this doesn't show you is whether that job seeker in that dot represents the skills, experiences that the employer is looking for. So it doesn't really talk about matching, skill matching, experience matching. So if anything, this kind of understates the tightness of the labor market. It's just looking at pure number of workers to pure number of job vacancies. Looking a little bit at employment, so the number of jobs. Minnesota finally regained full pre-pandemic employment levels last September after 42 months of recovery. So it took a while, but we got there in terms of jobs. Duluth Metro a little bit different. We have not reached those pre-pandemic levels yet. We're still about 5,100 jobs below where we were. Um, and that is the largest deficit of any of these metros. And to kind of show how that increase or that recovery has really plateaued, we added 0 jobs over the year into March. So this is what the trend looks like for Duluth metropolitan area. You can see it's kind of plateaued at a lower level there. Average earnings, so wages in the metro were up 4.4% over the year into March. Comparing that to the CPI, which is a measure of inflation, it was a little bit faster. So there's a little bright spot there. Employment might not be back up, but wages were rising a little bit faster than prices were as of last month. Another core concept for you, industry versus occupation. The simplest way to explain this, because we have tools that measure industry employment, occupational employment, is to say that industry represents what the business or the employer or the firm is doing. So as a manufacturer, a healthcare provider, is a business in accommodation, food services, construction, mining. Occupation represents what the individual worker does. So that could be a production worker, they could be someone in healthcare support, they could also be in construction or extraction, a mining worker, but it's focused on describing what the activity of the worker is doing as opposed to the activity of the business. So some more examples within business industry sectors like healthcare and social assistance and manufacturing, you have a wide array of different occupations. So these are the top occupations in each of these industries. Some of them match up pretty well. So you have a lot of healthcare occupations in healthcare, no surprise there. But you also have things like office clerks, food servers, non-restaurant. So there's a wide array, a good diversity of occupations within industries. I like to tell people when I'm really kind of showing this example is that you can have an accountant in any industry, for example. Manufacturing, you've got a lot of production occupations as we describe them, but you also have some shipping, transportation, and warehousing. You also have those like engineers, accountants, finance, all those other kind of supporting occupations that make manufacturing businesses happen. Adding to this talk about employment, and this is by industry sector for Northeast Minnesota. As I mentioned, we're about 5,100 jobs short of where we were in 2019, but the trend was not the same for all sectors. So depending on what industry you were in, you've tended to fare better or worse over the last 5 years, last 4 years. What we like to call our goods producing sectors, so construction, manufacturing, mining, they fared a lot better than the average industry over that term in terms of employment change. They either added jobs like construction and manufacturing, or like mining declined less than average. And then you have professional, scientific, and technical services and utilities, which are technically service providing sectors, but they're very closely tied to those goods providing sectors. A lot of engineering and architecture in professional and scientific and technical, for example, and then utilities is very closely tied to mining, construction, etc. So the fact that those all performed well, goods producing sectors were a little bit more protected against the impacts of the direct impacts of the pandemic, but there was also a lot of big projects going on at the same time that helped fuel the demand for them. And then most of those service providing sectors saw a larger than average decline. So you can see healthcare and social assistance, which is the largest employing sector in the region. About 1 out of 5 jobs is in that sector, still down about 5%. Arts, entertainment, and recreation, accommodation, food services, and other services, those are ones that were hit especially hard during the kind of peak of the pandemic. And you can see they still have larger than average deficits. All right, I'm going to pause here. We're going to transition to looking at the tools, but I would like to open it up if anybody has any questions on kind of the labor market update aspect of the presentation so far. No questions. I'm just going to make my cursor a little bit easier to see. So when I'm tooling around the screen, you'll be able to see it a little bit easier. All right. There we go. It's bigger now. All right, we're going to start looking at the tools. So there are a bunch of different ways to get to, oh, we've got a hand up. Yes, Troy.
Sorry, Carson. I was trying to give you the thumbs up when you said, "Are there any questions?" and I clicked the wrong the wrong button up there. So sorry about that.
Hey, no problem. No problem. It's good to hear that the audio is working, a confirmation. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways you can
Carson,
get to. Yes, go ahead, Sala.
yeah. Are you sharing this presentation?
Yes, yep. I'll be sharing both the link to the recording as well as the slides physically themselves in a follow-up email. So, yep,
Thank
you'll
you.
have all.
Thank you. No.
Yep,
Go
you're
ahead,
welcome.
please.
A couple different ways to get to our tools. You could web search Google MND data tools. You can navigate from our DEED homepage if you have that. But the link is right here. Open it up, and I'll throw these links. I'll try to throw them into the chat as we go, so you can kind of follow along. Okay, so that's DEED data tools. So however you get there, the DEED data tools web page will have a gray bar on the left that will list all the data tools by name. And then in the main part of the page, you'll also get those same data tools with a little more information on what they provide and the type of data that are available in there. So just to show you what that looks like, perhaps, there we go. So across the top, you've got the general DEED navigation. Data is where we're at, data tools. So that's how you get to this page we're on. So you can always go there if you get lost, just find that data tab. You can also navigate, this gray navigation bar will be available on most pages as well. So keep an eye out for that. You got your DEED data tools, and then I mentioned, our publications and monthly highlights and all that good stuff is all available here as well. LMI help is a useful tab if you get lost or you're not sure what you're looking at. So that is the DEED page. Okay. Some tips and tricks to keep an eye out. I mentioned that left gray navigation bar. Keep an eye out for that. When we get to each tool page, there's generally the same format. I say it's the landing page because it's not the tool itself for the most part. For the most part, you have to click another link or button to get to the actual data tool. They're usually built as apps, and then the landing page has a bunch of information about tutorials, other training material, how to use the tool, how we develop the data, etc. So there's methodology, and I'll show you that. But just know that sometimes when you click on that Louse link and you go to the Louse page, a lot of folks see the map and they're like, oh, here's the Louse data tool. And if you can get what you need from there, that's great. But for the most part, the actual data tool is another click away. Always look for the data home or tool name home link on the tool page. It'll get you back to where you came from if you lose your bearings or just want to return. And we're going to start out with local area unemployment statistics. So this is where we get our unemployment rates and labor force numbers that I was talking about earlier in the labor market update. Labor force, employment, unemployment rates. Those are the main components of what we can provide in local area unemployment statistics, but really handily, it goes down to those local areas. So cities that at one point, at least at one point had 5,000 or more residents. That may be different now. So there's some vestiges of cities that had 5,000 at one point that no longer do, that are still on this list. They lucked out. They still get local information. So small cities, counties, workforce service areas, which is super handy for folks in workforce development, economic development regions, those metro areas, and of course, statewide. And it goes back to 1976, monthly and annually. So it's a really long time series, which is also super handy. I threw up some of the most recent data as of yesterday here in the on the right. And you can see in Northeast Minnesota, the different statistics and how they vary You can see how unemployment changes quite a bit depending on what you're looking at. So the city of Duluth, 2.7% in March compared to the rest of Northeast Minnesota, 4.7%. So a pretty big difference in unemployment there. So let's look at it. This is what the landing page looks like, and I'll throw the link into the chat again. So you can join me and kind of explore together if you would like. So this is typically what the landing page of a tool would look like. You got your title, you've got either some links here listed across or some tabs that show more information. The data tool, so that's the link I was mentioning that you need to click on to get to the actual data tool. About Laos, how these data are created, when they're released, and then at LMI help. Almost every tool is going to have some sort of tutorial or training on how to use that tool. So just know that. This here is a summary of the information in the tool. It's not all the information that's available. It's just kind of the most recent information. So if all you need is the most current unemployment rate for St. Louis County, you come in and be like, okay, got it. If that's all you need, this is probably quicker than using the tool. But there's more diversity in the tool, more detail. I clicked on the tool. This is what the page looks like. So the first thing you do is you select the area that you're interested in. And you could select more than one type of area. So and it tells you how to do that here, control click. So let's say I want to compare my local planning area and then also a local county and city to Minnesota. I want to see how they're doing. So I get in, I select my type, and then I have the options within those types. So I selected Minnesota. I want to see how Carlton, and then we go down and scroll. We got to scroll a little bit, but then we can get to Cloquet and 7 County, Northeast Minnesota. And then once I've got them all selected, I click View Current Statistics, and we get the most recent. And hey, we got April now, between when I started and now. So we've got new information. Yeah, I'm seeing this with you for the first time. So it's like the moon landing almost. Minnesota, you've got a little more detail and you have seasonally adjusted data available, but labor force participation rate and the employment to population ratio are only available at the state level. If you go down more locally, you get labor force, employment, unemployment, that's the number of unemployed, and then unemployment rate. So unemployment rate is created by just dividing this unemployment number into this labor force number. You can see that in Carlton County, we're varying between 3.3 to 3.7% with Northeast Minnesota, and that is about 0.6 to 1 percentage point higher than the statewide rate, which is at 2.7%. If you want more historical detail, you can click this button to compare the areas for historical. So you can look at labor force, how that compares, unemployment, how that compares, or if you want to look at a specific area and see the trends for all of the data types, you click on the link of each area. You can also click on this little graph chart here. So let's go on that, and then you get to see it visually, which can be handy as well. All the different types of employment, unemployment, labor force, and then number of unemployed, and it compares to the state just by default. Go back to results. Let's look at how we compare across for all these areas. So it starts with unemployment, and you can see the frequency. So you got monthly or annual, the start year, the end year, the data set, or the variable you're looking at. Whether it's seasonally adjusted, that's only going to be show you for Minnesota. So if you do yes and hit update, you're only going to get Minnesota. So seasonally adjusted, I usually keep that to no to be able to compare different areas. So let's say I want to look at the annual for the entire series going back to 1976. For some of the local areas, it's only 1990 that's available to, but that's still some good data availability. I hit update when I'm ready. And you can see going back in time how unemployment has varied. So pretty useful. I can do the same thing with labor force, update it. And then if you want this in a more usable format that you can work with, download data is an option here. You click on that, and it just gives you what you're looking at basically in an Excel format. So I'll click that, and I'll open it so you can see what it is. It's CSV, excuse me. So it should be the same format roughly, same areas. You can see what they look like right there. Pretty easy. One thing that's interesting is it puts the most recent up at top, which is cool. But when I work with data, I usually go from oldest to most recent from top to bottom. So whatever your preference is. Okay, so this is Laos. I'm going to pause here to let you tool around if you're in there / ask any questions. So take a couple minutes to kind of mess around with it, and yeah, open for questions here while you work in Laos, or if you just have some general questions, feel free to ask them.
Hi, Carson. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, great presentation. Just wanted to, first of all, just acknowledge I walked into the meeting not knowing what to expect, and I'm just blown away by how easy you've made it. I'm curious about if you provide direct data feeds to other like, for example, county organizations as needed? Or do we,
Like a,
yeah,
oh, go ahead.
like a data file? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off there. So I guess this is kind of that. These are publicly available tools. So if you know how to get into tool, that's basically the data feed. So you can go into your county and just pull the most recent information. If you're kind of talking like an API,
Yes.
okay. I think that is possible to set up, but it probably takes a pretty onerous data sharing agreement. And since the information you're getting is going to be the same information that's available here, I would just say just use the Laos data tool. It's probably way easier than the bureaucratic work that you'd have to do to get an API set up.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's the first time I've gotten that question, by the way. So thank you. I can also follow up with the people who manage the site and ask them for I'll include that in the follow-up email, the definitive answer. But thank you. Okay, so Laos. I think everybody's an expert now, so I'll go back and we'll keep chugging along. The next tool, data source that I would like to cover is called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. And if you remember back to our industry versus occupation discussion, this focuses on industry, employment, and wages on a quarterly basis. And like Laos, it has very good geographic detail, and it goes back to 2000. So super detailed information in here, down to very small city, township level. And like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it covers about 95% of all jobs. So the jobs that won't be in here, self-employment, some random agriculture, and some random railroad jobs, because the railroad industry has their own unemployment system. So it's just like a very strange vestige of a different time that has lasted through here. But railroad, if you're really into railroad employment, just know that it's not all going to be represented in QCW. Number of establishments, so the number of businesses or firms. Total wages and average wages can be super handy, but employment is kind of the big thing that folks use quarterly census of employment and wages for. So how many jobs are in this industry? How is that differed from the previous year, et cetera. I mentioned the different geographies this is available for. And then if you really want to get into some really kind of neat but detailed data, business employment dynamics is kind of a subset of QCW that allows us to show, in addition to the net change, you can look at gross change, and then you can divide up gross change into, and I'm talking about employment and establishment numbers, you can see that gross gains and losses broken out by whether it's due to an establishment that opened or expanded, or an establishment, if it's job losses, if it's an establishment that closed or contracted. So you can see more detail kind of under the surface of what QCW shows, which is just those level changes. This can tell you, within manufacturing, yeah, we added a net 100 jobs in this city, but there was a lot of turmoil underneath where we lost a bunch of jobs in this specific sub-industry due to a closure or due to a huge contraction. You can get that more kind of rich detail using business employment dynamics. Within QCW, we created a new tool, location quotient tool. I know I was showing a couple of attendees this the other day. This is taking employment data by industry via QCW and just showing it in a visually compelling way. QCW kind of just gives you a table. This is taking that and showing you employment concentration relative to the state in specific industries and areas. And I'll show you this on the QCW page because there's a link on that, but I just wanted to talk about this before we dive into QCW. I'll throw the link to QCW in the chat so you can follow along again. This is the landing page for QCW, so it looks similar to Laos. You've got your links across the top. I mentioned the location quotient tool, so I'll show you that in a second. The data tool here itself is available via this link. You've got the tutorial, another link to the location quotient tool, just in case you missed it. And then this is, like in Laos, kind of a summary visualization. So if you just want some kind of high level information by large industry sectors, we have that available here. So for example, let's say you just want to know how your county did, or different sectors in you're in Anoka County. You can see how they've changed fourth quarter to fourth quarter 2019 to 2023 in terms of absolute job numbers. So you hover over it, you can see the sector, the levels, how much it changed, percent change, and then as well as the number of establishments and payroll. So some interesting kind of summary data here. There's a couple other tabs just showing employment, wages, establishments, and payroll by a specific area. And then trends. If you want to see this visually, you can see that as well. This is overall employment. So if that provides what you need, great, you can get it from here. If not, or if you're just really interested in more data, which I always am, I go into the data tool. This is the landing, not the landing page. This is the default kind of a view of QCW. So it starts out with Minnesota. You can see the geography here. It gives you your industry title, as well as the code there in the parentheses. So that's from the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS for short. The ownership. So this is interesting. We have the ability to tell you whether the firm or the employment is attributable to total, all ownerships, private, or government. And government, we can divide it into federal, local, and state. So that is super helpful. The year and then the quarter, and we're defaulting here to employment, which you can see in this tab up top. The annual number here, that is the average of these 4 quarters for employment. So if I was interested in the number of businesses or establishments by those industries, I just click on that tab. So this is the number of businesses, basically. Same setup as employment. Wages, this is total payroll paid to all employees in that industry at that area with that ownership. So you can see some big numbers. If that's a little overwhelming and not super useful to you, maybe average weekly wages is a little bit better. That may still be like a little like, it's tough to kind of parse. I take this and I just divide it by 52. You get your annual wage. That's relatively easy to do if the weekly wage isn't as useful. And then these starred tabs, that's where you get into business employment dynamics. So this, for example, will tell you the gross employment gains that you've seen in those industries, areas, ownership, et cetera. So you can kind of see how it's changed over each quarter. employment losses. So in order to get the net change, we basically just subtract the losses from the gains. And then if that's not enough for you, you can click on more BED, and then you get that detail I was mentioning before, whether those gains came from expansions or openings, or those losses came from contractions or closings. And there's even more, but I think that's fair enough to leave you with. Maybe it's tantalizing. You can dig into it a little bit more if you really want to, but that's what that is showing. And I want to go back to the main stuff. I usually stick to these 4 tabs. That's mostly what I'm working with in QCW. Some folks do like to dive into that kind of dynamic detail. But let's say I'm not interested in Minnesota and I'm interested in a different industry. I start here with step 1. They've got these arrows, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I want to change my area. Let's say I'm interested in some comparison and then also a little bit of time. So I want to compare to Minnesota. Same deal, you do control click to select multiple. And let's see, let's show the detail. So I'll go to a bigger city. Let's see how Duluth is doing. And then I'll throw in an economic development region for fun. So then it gives you the list within those types again. So Duluth, Arrowhead Economic Development Region, and you'll notice that Minnesota is not selected in here. It's just if you select it in this window, it'll automatically go through. So don't be worried that you don't see it. So I'll hit next. And then what I should see is the 3 different geographies here on the left, Minnesota, Duluth, EDR3. And the default is to show you these, what we call super sectors, these like big industry organizations. No worries, that's part of the steps. So let's say we're not interested in just the most recent information. We want to see how 2023 lined up with 2019. The change, so we're just interested in total all ownership. So that'll include government and private. So you can see the different government options here. If you wanted just government, you could do that as well. It brings you back so you can kind of see how you're doing if you're kind of showing the correct things that you want. And then industry. Let's say I am interested in total all, so that's all jobs across all industries. But then I have a very specific interest in a type of manufacturing. So I'm clicking these little plus buttons here to get us into more detailed industries. So if you don't know where your industry lays in these larger sectors, you can search up here. So I'm interested in equipment, transportation equipment manufacturing, but I'll just do equipment manufacturing. And I'll hit next. And it popped it open here for me. So transportation equipment manufacturing right here. I can select that. And if you wanted to, you could even divide that into more. So the number of digits here, the more digits you have, the more detailed industry. So 0 would be total all industries, and you got your super sector, your sectors, transportation at the 2 level, or manufacturing at the 2-digit level, industries at the 3-digit, so on. So just know that you have different ways of defining them as you go into more detail. So transportation equipment manufacturing, and I'm interested in aerospace product and parts manufacturing specifically. When I got the ones I'm interested in, hit next. And interestingly, there's really only 4 steps. Step 5, you're viewing, step 5 is to view, but it's got to start over there. So we've got what we hoping to see. We've got the geography, those 3. We've got total industries, transportation equipment manufacturing, and aerospace product parts manufacturing. And you'll notice that it's listed again. That's because we've got 2 different years. So it's first listed by geography, then by industry, ownership, and then year. So all of the different areas will be together, just so you know how that's organized. And you're looking at this, you're like, okay, that's cool, but I want to work with it. I want to be able to manipulate it. We've got a download option here. I click that. I get a CSV file again. And I will tell you, this format takes a little time to parse, but once you get it, it'll make sense. So I'll explain kind of what you're looking at here real quick. It's got all the information, including BED, business employment dynamics, but you start with your year. You've got your industry title, your industry code, ownership code, total industries is 0, your area, ownership title, so you know what you're dealing with. If you don't know that 0 represents that. State FIPS, you don't need to worry about these too much, but that just show you some more area code information. Industry level, so this is that, you know, which detail. So the higher the number, the higher the detailed industry. Don't worry about this pub order one. This is where you get into the information you're probably most interested in. So average EMP1 represents the average employment in quarter 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's employment. Average estab, that's your number of business establishments for first, third, second, third, fourth. Same thing with total wages. So total wages is the sum, not the average of wages across those quarters. So this is the total wages paid out in each of those quarters. And then the average weekly wage in those quarters. And then these 4 give you the averages and the totals. So total wage for all the year, average establishments across the year, employment across the year averaged, and then the average weekly wage across the year. So this is where I just very quickly will, you know, to find out what the annual average wage is, I just take this and multiply it by 52. And then you're like, oh yeah, okay, so that's decent wages. Yeah, they're like $13.76 a week. Is that decent? Now you have a little better idea. And then going further to the right, this is where you get all your business employment dynamics. Gross job gains is GJG total. So you get that by each quarter, gross job. And then the total gross job gains by expansion, gross job gains by opening, and it does the same thing for gross job losses. Okay, so that is QCW. I'm going to open it up here again for any questions and allow people to tool around a little bit. There's a little more detail in QCW than in Laos, so take a few minutes to explore and keep going. But yeah, happy to answer any questions in the meantime. Oh, I did promise to show the location quotient tool, so I'll show you where that is. Still feel free to ask any questions. So I'm going back to QCW home, and then the location quotient tool here in the top banner. This takes the employment information, and I have an average annual average employment data, explains what I'm doing here, but basically it's a ratio of industry employment in a specific area to a larger area that it's within. So for example, taking aerospace manufacturing employment in St. Louis County, dividing it by the total employment in that county for all industries, and then dividing that by the ratio of aerospace employment statewide. So if your location quotient or that ratio is above 1, that means you've got a higher concentration of aerospace manufacturing employment in that sub-region or sub-area relative to statewide employment in that industry. And this just has a different options to riff on that, either comparing industries within an area or comparing industries across an area. So for example, in Northeast Minnesota, may not be a surprise, the most concentrated sector is mining, 15 times as concentrated relative to mining across the state, because it's something like 70% of all mining jobs are in Northeast Minnesota. And then you can also do a tree map. Those are kind of fun if you know what those are. The box size is relative to the number of jobs. The box color, red means higher concentration, blue means lower concentration. There's a comment that says it looks like it's comparing local to national, not state. Well, I intended when I built this to compare it to the state. So if there's something that you notice that way, you can do that, and I think that's probably the more common use of employment location quotients. But in this one, it's divided into the state total. But thank you for that comment. We could do both. I just chose to do it within the state. It's just a little bit easier to set up and then you can kind of see how regions compare within the state, but that is totally another way you can do it. You can compare the areas. So Roseau County, of all the counties, has the highest concentration of manufacturing. I think we got Polaris. Oh, the definition. I see what you mean. Yeah. Okay. So that is just a definition. I think it was taken from a economics textbook. But that's a good point. I should update that so it says state. All of these are relative to the state down here. So good catch. Thank you. Roseau has the highest concentration of manufacturing, and then if you're a spatial person, you can look at it this way to see where the highest concentration is for a given industry. If I do mining, there's only so many counties that have enough mining employment to count or show up. St. Louis being a top one. There is mining and employment in Itasca in Lake County as well, a little bit in Aiken, but it's either too few of establishments or there's one business that is so large that we'd be able to identify it via subtraction that we have to suppress the information. So we always protect the confidentiality of businesses. So there are suppression rules built in for that. If you're wondering, if you're like, hey, I know there's a business in this industry, in this area, and it's not showing up, it's likely to be either one big one or only one or two there. That's usually the case. And then economic development region. Okay. Okay. Any questions on location quotient tool or QCW? Great. We will keep going. You're familiar with that now? All right. Census Bureau. This is where we get you get to have some real fun. So anybody that's worked with U.S. Census Bureau data knows that one, there's a ton of information. Basically, the richest resource for socioeconomic data available. So awesome in that sense. However, along with that ocean of data comes the necessity of navigating it, which can be tough at times if you don't know a few tricks, especially on their data.census.gov website. So what I propose here is just kind of just show you ways to get to some most common, most useful data in the quickest way possible. I'm happy to dive into detailed tables with anybody that's interested at another time. I have a system developed where I can get to the tables that I've used once before, and it took me like 20 minutes to find. Like, I know there's a way to divide up median income by race and age for this county, but it took me a long time to like put it together, things like that. So we're going to focus on these broader profiles via the American Community Survey, and I'm also going to show you how to get kind of just an intro profile that may get you the most common data that you can use, and it's really easy. If you don't want to dive into the weeds of the Census Bureau, this should help. So this is what the Census Bureau landing page looks like, and this is a national data source. So this is outside of DEED, but the data are so valuable, I think it's worth spending some time going through it. This is what the site looks like, and I can't zoom in for some reason. The first thing that you can do in this little search window here is, if you know the area you're interested in and you're kind of just looking for general information, is you can just type that in. So let's say we want to learn about Duluth. I type in Duluth, it gives me some options. We're not interested in Duluth, Georgia. So I click on it here, or I can click on this little map that pops up and get the profile. Click on the map. I love maps. And what will load is a data profile of all the most commonly used information from the Census Bureau. It takes a while to load because it's pulling from a bunch of different tables, but when it does show up, you'll see that there's great value in this, especially for the more casual census data user. You just have to be patient to get to it. There we go. Okay, so top line numbers here gives you, let's see if I can zoom in. There we go. Total population, employment, it tells you where it's getting these to. So like there's little blue links that may be hard for you to see, but these little blue links are the table of the source that they're pulling this data from, which is awesome. So if you want maybe a little more detail than what that top line is, you can always click on that and it takes you to that specific table. So number of households, income and poverty, so median household income, total housing units, race and ethnicity. So it's got the number of folks that are identifying as Hispanic or Latino. Education, 43.9% of folks in Duluth have a bachelor's degree or higher. And then the share of folks without health care coverage, 4.6%. And these are 2022 for the most part. You see some 2020 mixed in. Populations and people, if I scroll down, you get your median age for Duluth. It handily compares it to the median age of Minnesota. Duluth is younger than Minnesota. A lot of cities, that kind of makes sense. We also have a lot of colleges, so that brings our median age down. If you look at Northeast as a whole, we're older than Minnesota, so outside of Duluth, we get quite a bit older. Fun fact, Aiken is the oldest county by median age. And then you can see a population pyramid. Oh yeah, you want to see what happens when you click on one of the links. So say I'm interested in employment, which I am. I'll click on the link here. It's DPO3. So this is actually a good example because this is one of those data profiles I was talking about. So this gives you the detailed profile. It shows you the table with a bunch of different options here, but I'll talk about what's in the table first. So your DPO3, which is selected economic characteristics. So it's got employment status, your employment, unemployment. Handily, you need to know which source you're looking at because ACS, the American Community Service Survey, has 1 year and 5 year estimates. This one is referring to 1 year. 1 year is only available for areas that have like 65,000 people or more. Duluth meets that threshold, so you'll have 1 year availability. I like to use the 5 year just because the averages tend to get rid of some of that variability when you get to smaller areas. So I'll click on this and I'll go to the 5 year estimates. It shouldn't change a ton, but it's just nice to have that stability. So employment status, commuting to work, so how they got to work, whether the parents are in the labor force or not. So that's super handy for folks, for example, that are looking at childcare. They want to know how many people have both their parents in the labor force and kids under 6. That's where you have like really high need for childcare, right? So for example, like First Children's Finance or Children's First Finance will reach out to me for these data. I'm like, you can go to DPO3 and just grab it, but you know, I'm happy to provide it once a year when they ask for it. Because that's super, you want to know what the demand is for childcare. If you have 2 people working, you might have a higher demand for childcare, or if it's not 2 people, maybe you want 2 people to be working, and that could also be a measure of way to measure demand in childcare. Occupations, industry, so we talk about that. Class of workers, so that's whether you're private, government, self-employed, so this is where you can get some self-employed data. Unpaid family workers. Information on income, all types of sources, median household income you can get here, and how much families. So families differ a little bit from households. A lot of times they'll be the same, but not always. Household has to do with the housing unit specifically, and then families, you could have multiple families in a housing unit. And non-family households. Healthcare coverage also comes from here. It's available whether they're not in the labor force and have health coverage. So just like a ton of data here available. And yeah, the table is super huge. So it's nice to know what you're looking for, but believe it or not, I find this more useful than just going through data.census.gov in general. So if you know which profile you're using to, at least you can narrow it down to a table and get it that way. So I think if you hit back, you get to the profile again. Yep. So, and they have the links to the tables available down here where there's more information as well. Ancestry, languages spoken at home. This one is very relevant. So your older population, you want to know whether you have more folks over 65 relative to other areas? You can see that really quickly. How are people moving? That's also of interest to rural areas in Minnesota. Like, are people moving to our areas? If so, where from? You can answer that right here. Veterans, income and poverty, education. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but a lot of this is from that DPO3 file table I just showed you. Housing, so just really a rich for diversity of information available here. Then you can scroll across the top if you know the specific subject or topic you're most interested in. You can just jump to it. So I say start here. This is a great, yes, to answer your question, Heather, happy to do that. And that's the kind of thing, like, it takes a while to, if you want to slice and dice it in addition to this, you totally can. But I think starting at this broader point and then kind of getting an idea, it's like a great menu for census data. You start here. You don't need to mess around with the search function, which can be kind of clunky. You can just get to the table that you're interested in more directly because you know that data point is probably going to be in there because it's showing up on this page. So I'll give you a second to mess around with this. And while you do that, I'll just show you a little bit more about when you get to the table, what you're looking at. So I clicked on DPO2 link, which is selected social characteristics. But to focus in on what's the navigation components, these are all the different tables that showed up as relevant to what you were looking at. You can see you've got over 3,000 results. So, like, not super helpful if you're just using the search function. A lot of times that'll happen. If you want to filter, you can do that for a bunch of different ways. So mostly I'll filter by geography, and you can see the detail is really great in the level of geography. That's definitely value from census data. It goes down to smaller geographies than a lot of data that Deed provides, for example. Topics, if you want to change the topic, the source of the information, so the survey you got it from, and then you can also filter by year, and a bunch of other things down here that aren't as relevant or useful. So filtering here, let's say I've got Duluth up here. I want to add in St. Louis County. I go find my state, go find my county. I can also search up here for it. And there it is, St. Louis. I click on it and it should show up in the table as well with the same data. Yep, we're looking at age and sex. So now I've got St. Louis and Duluth in the same table. It's kind of hard to see here because, like, you've got a lot of information and you can't really maybe interpret it or absorb it. So if you want to download it, you got a couple different options here. You have the Excel, CSV. You can also download table data right here. That allows you to download more than one year at once. I just want to download what I'm looking at here into Excel. I'll click on that Excel button. I get a file, and I'll show you what it looks like real quick. The census gives you a lot of different ways to navigate to same kind of things. So it looks just like what it's like in that table, which is handy. So you are familiar with the format. You've got additional data. It gives you the link on where you got it from, which is nice. When you accessed it, it explains what some of the data are. But then you can work with it a little bit better and compare. So I always like to pull things down and then work with it in Excel. All right. I think that's enough for the census for now. Any questions before I move on? All right. Okay, so you'll get this later. We looked at DPO3, which is the economic characteristics profile. DPO2 is social. DPO4 is housing characteristics. So number of housing units, how much they cost, how many people are renting versus owning, all that type of stuff. And then some of that is also in DPO5, which is demographic and housing characteristics. So you'll get a lot. There's a lot of overlap between some of these profiles. I mostly use DPO3 just because most of what I'm working with has to tie to the economy. So, income, occupation, industry, employment status, labor force status, that's all DPO3. So most of the time I'm in DPO3, but DPO, just remember that when you're searching for them, a lot of the information is going to be available in one of these 4 profiles. You're well acquainted with the table format now. Okay, the next tool and source I want to talk about is quarterly workforce indicators. This is one that maybe is a little less well known. It's also a Census Bureau product, and I think it's been in development for a while, but it hasn't changed. So it's got great information, and the real value that I find in this is it gives you really detailed employment by industry, but then it breaks it out by demographic components. So you can get, for example, and I'll show some examples here. In the manufacturing industry in Duluth, what is the breakdown by gender? What is the breakdown by race or ethnicity, educational attainment, and age, if I didn't say age yet. So you've got those components, and you can see what your workforce looks like. So this is a super handy tool if, for example, you're looking at trying to recruit folks to your industry or to your business that are not historically represented. This would be a great way to find out who those folks are. It goes down to the county. Duluth is an exception to that because Duluth is a workforce service area. So the workforce service area, very handily, is one of the geographic areas that you can use in QWI. That is also not super common. Okay, so here's an example question. Which industry has the largest share or number of BIPOC workers in the Duluth MSA? So Black, Indigenous are people of color. Number, healthcare and social assistance, but that's also the largest industry, so that's not super surprising. Accommodation and food services is also a large industry. Transportation and warehousing, not super huge. So let's look at the share. Arts, entertainment, and recreation actually has the highest share of its workforce as non-white, and 15.7%. By comparison, the total population in the Duluth MSA, I think there's like 12 or 13% people of color. So that's according to the population, but then you can see the average for employment is about 9.6%. So public administration, which is like government largely, accommodation and food services, and real estate rental and leasing all have higher shares of workers of color. And then most sectors have less than that, which is interesting to see. The least diverse by that measure are mining and utilities, which also happen to be 2 of the 3 highest paying industries in the region. What about how has the share of teenage employment changed since 2000? That's another question you can answer with QWI. This is all age groups, but you can pull out the teenage employment at the bottom. In 2000, teenage workers represented 10.5% of all jobs in retail. By 2022, it's 9%, so overall a decline. But you can see that in the so 2010s through 2017, 2018, we actually had less than that. So we've seen an increase over the last couple of years in the share of teenage workers in retail. So the low point was kind of at the Great Recession, and it's built back up. At the same time, at the oldest age group, you see 65 plus, that's been growing in general across all industries. So it's no surprise to see that share widen as we get closer to 2022. We've got more older workers in general. We've got more older workers in retail as well. And then which industry employs the largest share of workers with at least a bachelor's degree? So using that educational attainment data that's available as well. This is the breakdown. So educational services, perhaps no surprise, has the highest share of folks in that industry that hold bachelors at least. That makes sense. A lot of professors, a lot of teachers have gotten their bachelors. So that is no surprise. But then we know that like professors and teachers only make up X amount of employment in educational services. So just like all those other industries, there's a bunch of other jobs in educational services in addition to teachers and professors. Professional, scientific, and technical services is the second one. Again, that's your architecture, engineering, computer design services. A lot of occupations that tend to require some advanced training. So that's no surprise. Utilities up there. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got accommodation, food services. So that's a lot of your service jobs, bartending, restaurants, hotels. And they tend to have lower educational attainment requirements to get into many of those occupations, and therefore have the lowest share of jobs or workers that have at least a bachelor's. This is just to show you another example of what you can do with QWI. So this is the number of male and female workers in Minnesota. It says Northeast Minnesota, but this is going to be Minnesota. The share that's male, the share that's female. So it's sorted by the percent of employment that is female. Healthcare and social assistance, number one, it's about 70, 75, so 3/4 of workers or jobs in healthcare and social assistance are held by women. And then it shows you the male average annual earnings, because that's available in QWI, compared to the female average annual earnings. And I'll point out that I think in every instance that female earnings are below the male average earnings. I think finance maybe was one where they're, no, never mind. That's an even bigger gap. So let's look at QWI real quick. While we're here, I'll throw it into the chat again. Yeah, question, is this all employees full and part-time? Correct, it is. All. And you can filter by that, I believe. So this is what QWI Explorer looks like. You've got your geographic level, your indicator. So if you don't want to look at employment, you could also look at how many hires have happened, how many separations, so people leaving jobs, and then turnover. So that's the churn kind of underneath that top line net change number. Same thing with firm job gains, job losses. This is similar to that business employment dynamics I showed you in QCW. Same thinking there, so you can see some of that churn underneath. And then earnings, that's where we got that earnings number in that table I just showed you. Employment's kind of the main one that I'm interested in. Let's say I don't want statewide Minnesota. You've got your county. You can also look at metro areas or WIA, your workforce investment area, workforce service area. This is super handy. Not a lot of data is available easily in these geographies. So let's say I'm interested in Northeast Minnesota, WSA. If I wanted to see the kind of quirk with this is if I selected multiple, it's going to sum them. So you can't compare them like you would in the census data.census.gov, like side by side. This one sums them together. So if I selected multiple, I would get those areas added up. Just so you know, I selected Northeast Minnesota workforce service area. It gives me by quarter the employment levels by age. So that's your default. If I was interested in a specific industry, I can do that. I can do by sector, 3 digits, so more and more detail. Just know that as you go into more detail, there tends to be more suppression. So I like to stick up at the sector level, especially when I'm in just like one workforce service area or one county, so I can get more information. Say I'm interested in construction. And again, if you select here in these filters, it's going to sum up these industries. I want to know how construction is looking. You could also filter by different firm ownership, how long the firm's been around, the business has been around, and then also how long the business or how big the business is in terms of employees. I'm going to keep that blank for now. And then worker characteristics. So I'm already looking at age, so that's filtered out. But if I wanted to, I could look at just male or female employment by age. And you can also select another one, but in order to do that, I would have to change the group I have over here, which is currently age. Okay, so I've got quarters. You can see the variation, seasonal variation, which is more common in construction. Let's say I want to get rid of that and I just want to see the yearly averages. I can do that. So each line represents a different age group. You can see this big increase here. That's 55 to 64, so that's showing the aging. Youngest down here also has seen some growth recently. So this is handy to see kind of the trends in general. If I was more interested in, say, ethnicity, we can do the same thing. Like ethnicity, so this is Hispanic or Latino, or not Hispanic or Latino. It's tough to see any sort of change here when you put them on the same y-axis because one is so small relative to the other. Same thing with race. You've got white and then, workers of color down here. If it's red in this table, so this table represents what's being shown up here, that just means that the data are suppressed because there's probably too few observations. If you wanted to download it and work with it on your own, you can click Get Data, and then you have your options on how you want to download it, either including or not including the chart, etc. You can also share it and get like a PDF report. So there's a bunch of different ways you can look at the information in here. A bunch of different ways you could slice and dice the employment. It's super handy. I use quarterly workforce indicators quite a bit. If someone's interested in like those questions I mentioned at the beginning, what does my workforce look like, etc. So really cool. And happy to dive into more detail with folks that are more interested in this at another point. We have more things to talk about, so I'm going to go back to the presentation. I think this is the last tool I'll probably be able to get to today, but it's a super important one to talk about, graduate employment outcomes. We've had it for a while. One of the researchers in our office, Lesia Liebert, put these data together probably about a decade ago. And what it is it's connecting graduate data from higher education institutions in Minnesota, and it's connecting it with wage records that we have, so we can say, graduates from this program at this school ended up employed 2 years later in this industry, in this region, making a median wage of this. We can say things like that. So super handy to kind of track for workforce development and economic development folks that want to know, like, hey, are we retaining our manufacturing production grads? Are we retaining, a specific major or degree type of workers? Are they all, going somewhere else? That's especially of interest to a lot of rural workforce development and economic development entities. So you can look at that sort of thing, but also from the educational side, if you want to know where your graduates are going, this is a super handy tool. A lot of the information that schools will collect themselves are surveys. So they reach out post-graduation to alumni and ask them in a survey, but those are, they have to respond to those. And the data from those, from what I've seen, can be really spotty. So this is a much more administrative look that covers a lot more information and gives you a lot of great detail. So let's look at it. And this is one tool that we've kind of added on to quite a bit. So we've created a bunch of new visualizations, including this one on the landing page. So this one cuts through to the core of the income question. So let's say, or wage question. Let's say you want to compare some wages across different programs at a specific award level. You can do that. So what you're looking at here is a couple of selected programs. So majors is another way to think of those. Across all award types are like your degree or certificate. Let's say I'm interested and I want to compare some associate degrees programs. You've got your instructional program here. Again, that's like your your major. And right now it's showing carpenters, biology, biochemistry, clinical counseling. If it doesn't have that program, it won't show up in here. Computer science is one that's going to be interesting. Okay, so this here is your 2-year wage. So that's graduates in Minnesota that are employed in Minnesota. If you're employed outside Minnesota, we don't have information on them, wage records, so they won't show up. But of those grads that are employed in Minnesota 2 years later, this is the median wage. And then it gives you what the instructional program is called, and then the total number of graduates that are employed in Minnesota that year. And then as you move to the right, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I think that's 7 years post-graduation, because this is for 2016 graduates in 2022. So 6 years later. You can see the earning potential changes. So there may be a program where you start out making a relatively low wage, but there's some other certification or something that most people get, like in engineering, and then your income earning potential skyrockets. So that can happen like in medicine, for example. There's a lot of training, and then once you do that training, you make a big wage. Computer kind of starts out high and stays high, computer science. So this is just a way to compare that sort of thing. But that's just one piece of graduate employment outcomes. This is what the actual tool looks like. Again, you can go back to the landing page. If you want to dive into the methodology, super detailed information on how these data are all collected, and then a glossary of terms. We've got your different graduation years available here. So everything from 2014-15 up to 2020, 2021. They lag a little bit because we have to wait 2 years for the outcome information to come through, so the wage data. If we were to do it a year later, there's a lot of churn happening for those graduates. They haven't quite landed somewhere yet, so we waited 2 years, or Alessia, we decided we wait 2 years to have those outcome measures. The different award types, institutional types, so public, private, for 2-year. You could select individual schools. So let's say I want to see what Hamline University graduates look like, and I want to look at all programs, but you can go down and look at specific different programs if you want to dive into ones specifically. I click view results, so I get all the programs that are available at Hamline. It tells you what you're looking at here. There's multiple tabs, but in the first tab, you get focused on hourly wage. The number of graduates for these larger aggregate programs. So let's say in business, actually it looks like education is the top graduating program here, and you've got the more detailed instructional programs. With graduates 2 years after graduation, how many of them are employed? What is their median wage if available? If there's NA, it's either too early or there's fewer than 10 graduates counted in that category. The top industry of employment, go figure, it's elementary and secondary schools for education. If you want a little more detail on that, you can click on this little chart and it gives you, if there are other industries that folks are employed in, it will give you that. So 83% of Hamline graduates in 2021 in this education general program were employed, and you can see here, it's actually the average of the last 4 years, were employed in elementary and secondary schools. So that's super handy if you're in that and you want to know where those graduates are ending up. Is it higher or lower than what you want? You can download those data. In the same way, you can see geographically where they end up. So in Hamline, I would expect a lot of folks to stick around the cities, and that's the case. But then you also have 8.5% of those graduates working in Central. And the rest of them are probably too small to report, but they're going elsewhere. So a lot of great information there. This is a little more detailed data on your wages. So you got your annual median wage, which is different from your hourly median wage, especially when you're talking about education, because teachers don't work the entire year. So wages annually differ from some hourly wages. And then employment status, this is where it shows you how much we know. So for example, we were able to follow 100% of communication journalism grads at Hamline. We know where all of them are. None of them are continuing education, and none of them have an employment outcome unknown. This employment outcome unknown is probably either employed in a different state or we just don't have wage records on them. And we're getting close to time. So I just want to run back, and I will stick around, but I'm going to wrap it up for the folks to respect the time that we have. We built some other tools out of graduate employment outcomes. I don't have enough time to talk about it right now, but just know that we also have these data that compare against cost of living and typical debt. So that could also be handy for folks that are considering different programs and the outcomes there. On the Map was another really cool tool that can show you if you're interested in commuting patterns and really detailed custom geographies. That tool is also available. Occupational employment and wage statistics gives you it's kind of the inverse of QCW. So instead of looking at industry employment and wages, it looks at occupational employment and wages. So super handy for folks that are trying to set wages or want to be competitive or know what to expect in terms of wages if they're going in for an interview or negotiation, et cetera. So that's super detailed occupational data. This is just an example of the type of information that's available. The grant example, for those, and I apologize, for those that are willing to stick around, I'll talk through this grant example. And then other tools and resources. So I just talked about 5 tools. We have over 24 different tools in addition to those publications and other resources. I encourage you, and you've got links here to them when I send this out, to explore, especially the regional and county data profiles. They're kind of like, I showed you that census profile. They're kind of like our local version of those census profiles and include a lot of census data, a lot of RD data, and are another like menu or window into try and find the most commonly used socioeconomic and LMI. So I'll open it up for questions, and those that need to take off, I really appreciate your time. Sorry I had to compress there at the end, but there's just so much data to talk about that you never have enough time to cover it all. So you'll have to come back for another training session or go to one of my counterparts training sessions. So they're putting on sessions this month as well and next month. So keep an eye out for that. Same place you sign up for this one. So if you want more or want it delivered in a different fashion, I encourage you to reach out to your local regional labor market analyst. But with that, thank you so much for your time. Hope you have a great day. And if you want to stick around, I'm happy to talk and answer any questions. Thank you very much. I'll stop the recording now.